right, so last time I don't. In proving a point, I did some very strange things. So oh, come on. There we go. All right, starting again. So last time, in a kind of quick introduction, I talked a little bit about the generalities of the Maya interface and the first round of basic keyframing. So to run back through that quickly, it's important to remember in Maya, I talked about, there's different menus for the different kind of modes of the program, and it's important to kind of understand what is in this box or what mode it's in, because that always changes the sort of menus and options you have available. A side note to that is something known as the hot box. I don't name these things, but that's what it's called. So hot box is basically if you hold down the spacebar. And you can set it up to show you as many or as few of these menus as possible. So if I go here to the controls, I always have mine to show all. So basically every menu possible, you can get to it just by holding down the spacebar. And you'll see me do things that way more and more. Here, along the top here, you've got tabs, which kind of have a few buttons to different menus, creation things. Everything you see in the tab is also in the menu. It's just kind of shortcuts. So one of the first things we did, so I'm in polygon menu, just making a cube. And as I mentioned last time, the important thing to understand in Maya is any object is described by a set of attributes that tell you its shape, its location, its rotation, material attributes, everything. Everything is an attribute, and that becomes more important today because I'll talk a lot about attributes. And the reason why that's important is if you're used to kind of normal, say, modeling environments, so just like normal Rhino, if you were going to make a cube, you would say, cube, and it would say like how wide, and you would say how wide. And if you wanted to change its size after you made a cube, you would generally, then use the scale command and then scale it. Where Maya, its size is just a property of the object. So in the polycube here, its width, depth, and height are just dynamic attributes. So if I wanted it to be bigger, I just make it bigger. And the reason why that is everything in every bit of description is a dynamic attribute, so it can be animated over time, right? So everything's dynamic, which means that you can change the value of that attribute over time. Yeah, I mean that's what it's an animation program, so it makes it where you can animate everything. And it's important to understand that because it doesn't care if it's scale, scale, fluid properties, material attributes. It's all the same stuff. It's just numbers. And because it treats everything as just numbers, you can animate everything, and as we'll look at today, you can start to build up these sort of complex systems by relating the attributes together. When I mentioned time, down at the bottom is what is just known as the timeline, because of course we have single objects that we're going to manipulate over the course of time. How do you change what the time is? So it's a single object. frame 1, frame 2, frame 3, frame 4. The basic interface to this, you'll see the numbers on the left of like the smallest amount of the time that's visible and the maximum. So right now it's only showing frames 1 through 24. You can have basically as many frames as you want. So if I want to see more frames, I could say, just type in 500. It's not like they didn't exist before. It's just like saying, all right, now look at this range of time or look at this range of time. Then to the right are, basic play functions. Play forward, play backwards, step back to the next key, step back 1 frame, go back to the very beginning, and then step forward 1 frame. Step forward 1 key, 1 frame, and to the end. And so the first thing I showed you was the sort of basics of animating a box moving up in the air. I'll go through that again. So the process we're going to use and we're going to talk about here is keyframe animation. I explained it a little bit, but keyframe animation is used in everything. So basic idea being defining a start value in time and an end value in time and letting the program sort of interpolate in between the two. So in this really sort of basic setup of if I want the box to move from here to here, unlike sort of traditional animation, I don't have to define it at every frame. I just define, here's your start point, here's your end point, take this much time to go there, and it interpolates between the two values. So to do that, the keyframe basically stores the value at a time. First way I showed you, which I'm going to go back to because it is a little cleaner and I remembered why. So if you're wanting to do one specific channel, you can highlight it, right click, and say key selected. And you can see it turns that orange, right? So it's saying like, that value is essentially at frame 1, the translate Y value is stored, right? It knows it's fixed at that time. If I want to then define it somewhere else, the important thing to remember, because it'll drive you crazy if you don't, is you always change the time first. Change the time and then change the value. If you do it the other way, it won't remember it and it'll keep snapping back and you won't know why. But just always change the time, then change the value. So to do that, I can either just drag this across here to say frame 100 or just type in 100. And then I'm just looking at translate Y, so there's a couple different ways I can input that value. I can just type the number in directly, like if I know I want it to go to say 10 units up, that's not really enough, so let's call it 50. I can do it to 50, or I could have also just used the move tool by either clicking here or using the hotkey W. But as you can see, everything's linked, right? Like even though I'm using the move tool, all it's doing is just changing the Y attribute. So I'm going to say that's good enough. And I'm going to key it again. So now, as I pull the timeline, box drops, right? Really straightforward. So the first thing I looked at was, okay, you set this animation up, you have it where it's going from 2.463 to like 40 over this time period. You realize that's not actually what you want, right? You actually say you want it to go from 1 to 50. The process isn't, again, it's not, okay, delete all the keyframes and do it again. The keyframes themselves are also dynamic, so you just change their properties. You just adjust it. So you put the keyframes in and adjust them to get it to move how you want. You can do that a couple of different ways. The easiest way to kind of understand is if you go under Window and Animation Editors and the Graph Editor. And as I mentioned last time, it only ever shows what's selected in the Graph Editor. So if I pick the cube, you'll see these lines appear. And when I click into the Graph Editor, I'm going to press F, which is the frame function. It's kind of like zoom extents. It works for models, it works in the graph, it works in everything. You can always just hit F, and it'll show you everything. So, if you look here, I've set 2 keyframes, so you see the 2 points in there. Again, in this graph, x-axis is the frame, and the y-axis is the value. So if I select this, you can see this also in the value here, so frame and value, right? Same thing here. Frame 1, value 2 point whatever. If I wanted to change that value, there's 2 different ways I can do it. I can again type in the number, so let's say if I want it to go to 1, and hit enter, it snaps down to 1. At this point, after I highlight it, I can also hold down the middle button and just drag it. So you can see again, you can always do things 2 ways. If you have specific values, you can type them in. If you want to just eyeball it, you eyeball it. It's kind of what you're after. In this case, I know I do want it to go to 1, so I'm just going to put it in. Same thing with our second keyframe. When I pick it here, it says frame 100 and the value of 41.83. And again, I can move this. Oops. Again, highlight it till it turns yellow, hold down the middle button, and you can drag it. In this case, I'm actually changing both values, right? Like I'm changing when it's set in time and the value. So I'm going to do this one by typing in the numbers as well. So 100 and 50. So these are our 2 keyframes. And the nice thing about the graph editor is it makes it very clear as to what's happening. You have this point's defined, this point's defined, and then you have a line that's connecting them, right? When the playhead, which represents the frame, where that intersects this line is the value that you get that frame, right? I mean, it's like very old school kind of math, right? Like draw a line, where does it intersect that line? Get the value. That's it. You can see here, I mean, the line itself has its own sort of smooth to it. We can change that by altering the sort of tangents between the lines. If we want to say make it go exactly the same. So here, I've said, okay, don't smooth between the 2, go exactly between the 2. If you want to control those things yourself, you can also pick the keyframe, then grab the handle, and adjust how those things smooth together, which gets down to really, really fine detail. I mean, not only like point to point, is it kind of a smoothing function? Does it ramp into it? I mean, you can basically control things however you want. So that's for one of them. So now I could also, start to layer other things in with it. I'm going to close this because I don't have screen space. So I'm going to go back to the beginning. And right now, if I pull it, it's already moving up. If I wanted it to move up and rotate, I just start to add that on as well. So rotate Y, because again, Y is up in Maya, as you'll see. So to do that, change the time and then change the value. I actually want it to start at 0, so all I need to do is key it.
Is there a hotkey for that?
The hotkey only keys everything. If you press S, it keys everything. If there is, I somehow don't know it. If you realize that I've been doing it this way for years and not knowing, I'll be slightly embarrassed, but very happy if you tell me. That's mostly just my habit of that way. It kind of was clear last time, the sort of downfall of keying everything. So I usually just do them as few as possible. So here we've keyed it at 0. I could also say go to 100 again. And I can make that, say, 360. So I change the time, change the value, and then key it. Because if I don't key it, it's not actually going to store it. So now, yep, I mean, really straightforward. Now if I look at the graph of this, there's 2 lines, right? Not surprising. The way you can tell, I have the whole object selected now, so you see everything. If you only want to see one of the values, you can just click on it here. So that's just the translate Y. This is the rotate Y, or both. Same thing though, right? So frame 1, it's at 0. Frame 100, it's 360. What happens everywhere else is just an interpolation on the line. It seems really simple, but the fact that it's simple is actually what makes it a pretty powerful tool. I mean, the fact that all you're doing is making basic line graphs lets you start to animate lots of different things. So, of the things I'll start with today, in terms of the interface as well, right now I'm in wireframe. If you want to go to shaded, you can do that under shading. Yeah, you can go under shading and say to smooth shade. You'll only really ever see me do the hotkeys, which are 4 is wireframe, 5 is shaded, 6 is material, if we have material, and 7 is lighting. So I'll hardly ever use the menu, it's just mostly a hotkey thing. So how do we get something more exciting than a box rotated? At the end of the day, I can tell you for the first sort of physical experiments we'll do probably starting next week. At the end of the day, it will come down to just some boxes rotating. As I showed you last time, there's really no difference. Once we get into the hardware world, all we're using is a simple little plug-in where the physical stuff is also just playing when you hit play, right? So, Servo understands the number 0 to 180, and it's no different than a number here. So we'll have little things rotating and then rotating in real life. So more complex, say, things than a single object moving along. The first thing that's important to understand of building a bit of complexity is just looking at simple hierarchies. Easiest way to understand hierarchies is this, right? You have folders, and then you have, I have my Dropbox folder. In that folder has other things, and there's folders in that folder. If I move the top folder, everything else goes with it, right? So if I is there anything that one? Yes. So obviously, if I'm within the hierarchy, anything I happen down here doesn't matter. But if I move the hierarchy higher up, everything else goes with it, right? So if you move a top folder, everything goes with it. If you move a bottom one, it doesn't affect the top. That's the way all animation software works, right? So you always want to have who's the parent? It's always called parent-child relationship, right? So what's the sort of base, and what's the sort of subassembly. So to do that, let's say I wanted to have this thing moving up, which it's already doing. But let's say I wanted to, for some reason, attach a second rectangle on the end and have it rotate in another direction, right? So it'll be like almost like a propeller. So since we're sticking with simple objects for now, I'm just going to drag a new one here. So what I want to happen is I want this one to be rotating, say, around the X and spinning with the other one at the same time. So the box is already spinning, and I want this one to rotate in the X. What I don't want to have to do is calculate on this one, all right, what is its actual position in translation as it's moving up? I just want to say, stick to the front of this box and rotate, and basically let it solve everything else out. So even though this, in the end, it will be translating, rotating in the Y and rotating in the X, I'm only going to rotate this one in the X and then just connect them in the hierarchy. So first of all, I'm going to move it kind of into place. It doesn't have to be super accurate, so I'll leave it there. And now first what I want to do is say, I want you to be a child of this box, right? So this box being the kind of top folder, you now also hold the properties of this guy. There's a lot of different ways to do that. The hotkey way of doing it, well, if you first pick the child, then hold shift and pick the parent, the hotkey for it is P. Or if you pick the child, then the parent, and go edit parent, same thing. Or if you look in this magical thing known as the outliner, which is a bit cramped because of my screen resolution for the projector. What's wrong with? Actually, I can't see it. Normally, you'll have a little view down here that's the perspective in the outliner, but instead I'll open it here and just say Window Outliner. So the outliner is a wonderful little thing, which is basically the sort of list and hierarchy view of everything that's in your scene, right? So as I mentioned before, Maya works off of everything has a name. That's how you get things to relate to each other. So it's the same thing. If I click on p cube 1 here, it selects p cube 1, right? I mean, it all works in tandem. If I pick it here, I can see it's there. If I want to give it a new name, which I will this time, I'll call it base. Everything updates. And I'm going to call this guy prop. Yep. Once you start doing these things, always name stuff something that makes sense. If you start getting, once you start getting like fairly complex things and everything's called like p cube 1 and NURB circle 7, like you just make yourself, you make a nightmare for yourself. Just give them names, right? So when you look at these, like what makes sense? Well, what is this thing? Well, it's kind of the base. What do you call it? It's a base, right? Same thing when we look at a little bit of the kind of expressions in programming, like naming variables. Name them something that makes sense because you forget instantly. Not just you, but, well, everybody. So we can also, the outliner, you know, it even looks like folders, right? I mean, so in the same way, if I want to bring the prop under the hierarchy of the base in the outliner, I can pick prop. Again, hold down the middle button or press it on the scroll wheel, drag it on top of it, and now it's parented to it. You can see that now because also when I click on base, it has this little plus sign. When you click on the plus sign, it shows you everything underneath it in the hierarchy. Um, and there's the prop, right? I mean, it's just like folders. You can also see, like, even now when I select the base, the prop highlights, right? Because it's underneath it, so you're going to affect it with whatever you do. So now, I mean, we haven't done any animation to the prop at all. But if when I move the timeline, it's animated. Again, really, it's a simple thing, but it's hard to get your head around. I mean, it's all about kind of final effect and breaking it down into the pieces, right? It doesn't matter how you get there. I mean, could I calculate its own center point and animate this by hand as well to kind of slowly follow around the box? You know, keyframing it with all the exact right rotations? Absolutely. Do I want to do that? No. Use the tools you've got. So this is our base. It rotates, and since this is now connected to it via the hierarchy, it's going to rotate as well. So now, if we want to add a second behavior to that, all we need to do is just to animate the rotation of in the X for this guy. So to do that, I pick the prop. It's rotate X. And I'm going to key it. Then go to frame 100. Give it a new value, call it 720. Key it again. And the result is
you break your parent.
You break the parent by, you can either pick it and say unparent, or if you look again in the outliner, outliner. In the outliner, if you go and pick prop here, again hold down the middle button and drag it back up to the. And now, of course, since I've unparented it, right? It still has its animation, it's just not combined with anything else. So I'll parent that back to it. So this can go on and on and on forever. I'll add one more, or a couple more. I'll do. So So now, if I want to attach these two, again, I can do it either here, so pick the child, parent P, child parent P. It's all about making, combining simple actions. Like all this stuff, it's not about, you don't do anything complex in one step. It's just like break it down, just like we were talking about like with the machines. What are the simplest actions that are then combined together to kind of give you a sort of overall effect. All right, so let's save this. I'll try and remember to save these along the way, and then upload them. So you guys, if you want to look at these files afterwards, you can have them. So that is in a very quick way the sort of basics of hierarchy. Actually, I'll show you one more thing here. So, in the spirit of anything can be animated, we'll do something else before I jump forward. So, let's say if I have just a normal polysphere and want to do something simple like this is hard to do without looking at the screen. I'm sorry. So I want to pick that and say edit mesh and extrude all the faces. Oops. First, actually I'll just do one. So the other way first. All right, I'm starting over. So we have my sphere. Let's not keep them together. Forget it. I'll just do one. So what I did here, I picked the sphere and I held down the right click button, and I'm going to go down to the face and basically pick a sub-object, which obviously the object is the sphere, the sub-object is the face, right? It takes faces to make a sphere. And now I'm just going to extrude that face. So edit mesh, extrude. Right? No big thing. I can do the same thing over here. I'm going to pick the face. And again, I use a hotkey on that, which is the letter G, which is whatever the last command was. So it knows the last command was extrude. So to do that, so I'll pull that one out a little bit. And G. Yeah. So again, if you're used to kind of thinking in like normal modeling environment, you take a face, extrude the face, and then once you do that, it's kind of done. If you want to do it again, you kind of redo it, re-extrude it at a different height. But what's important to see is once I did that, when I go into the channel box over here, there's these new attributes called poly-extrude face 1, poly-extrude face 2, poly-extrude face 3. That's because all sort of even modeling commands are dynamic, right? It's not a one-time deal. They're just like a new modifier that can then be adjusted. And if they can be adjusted, this may surprise you, they can be animated. So poly-extrude face 1 has all of these properties. the main one we're concerned with right now is the local translate z. So the local translate z property tells it how far to extrude. If I flip it to 0, it's not extruded. But again, it's just a number that is an attribute. So we can animate or control or program any of these attributes just like we did with rotation. It doesn't care. So to do that, it's exactly the same process. I'm going to go ahead and give us more frames. I'll do it for 100 again. So I'm on frame 1. Want this at 0 and say key selected. Go to frame 100. Say 10. Key selected. Right. Do the same thing with these guys. That's number 2. I'll say, yeah, you can start here. So we'll key it. We'll go to like 50. Make it 10. Key it. Go to 100. Take it back to 0. And key it. So I'll do this one as well. Only, yeah, we'll start it at 0. So we're on frame 1. We moved the frame first, gave it the value, keyed it, went to 100, gave it a value of like 6. Keyed it. And I can also do things like so if I could set local scale X. Also, the hotkey, if I'm doing it here, of just like a slider on anything, if you highlight it, and then again, holding down the middle button, you can just drag left and right, and you can do it as basically a slider for every value. So I'm looking at, let's say also scale, local scale X and Y. Oops. Change those back to 1. 1. Key those 2. And then I can say make 3. And key selected. So just like I showed you before, I'm doing 2 of them. In the same way of right clicking, I can do more than one at once. So I key them both all at the same time. So now we have, right? Because again, all we're doing is changing numbers. It's numbers changing over time, but letting the commands mean different things. In the same way, this is happening. I could also then say, just simple combinations, right? Lots of very, very dumb actions that then get combined together into something, well, slightly more complex. I wouldn't call it complex, but slightly more complex. You could also, if you wanted to, do here just for the fun.
Taking parent, just like components of an object to another object rather than whole object to object?
Not by default, no. I mean, there's other ways to kind of connect them to do that, but by default, general parenting is only object to object. There's ways to kind of connect other things, but. So, that was just me then smoothing it.
Can it have like different parents based on like time frames? Can it like get rid of a parent and become a parent?
Not really. There's ways around it, which is what we're going to kind of look at now. So the tricky part with is the answer is yes, but not. Don't. It's a bit. There's always ways to go around it. In actual just parenting, no, but there are other ways to do it. Say like, okay, and during this time you're parented to this one, and this time you're parented to this one, and this time you're parented to that one, and you can just like animate the sort of switch of who you're parented to. But that's a little farther down the road. So the big jump that I'm going to make here, I'll save this one too. Is getting out of the world of keyframing a bit and being able to set up relationships between the objects, either kind of proportionally, mathematically, whatever you want to call it. So the way we're going to do that is instead of basically you defining the value, we're going to basically make a couple of little mathematic functions that will define the value. As I'll show you together, I mean, these things, it's not a kind of either or type situation. All the sort of techniques all work together, but I'll show you this one individually. So if you remember last time, I had this ball, moving up and down, right? Because I keyframed it here, keyframed it here, keyframed it here. So what I'm going to show you now is a way to do that without, instead of doing a keyframe, basically performing a very simple function on the timeline. So to do that, we're going to use the expression editor. So we're going to go Window, Animation Editor, Expression Editor. So when you open the expression editor, it's going to show you, again, whatever object you have selected and its attributes, so visibility, scale, whatever. This stuff doesn't really matter, and then this little area where we can write it, write our function. So the way that you address objects and expressions or connect objects and expression is by their name, right? If I want to do something to this sphere, I have to know its name. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm actually just going to call it ball.
Is it cap sensitive?
Yes. Also, as a general note, because everything works off of names, you can't have anything any two things with the same name, right? So otherwise it gets confused. So now I'm going to go back to Window, Animation Editor, Expression Editor, and I'm going to write something dealing with the translate y of this object called ball. I'm just going to write it out. So I'm going to say ball dot translate, and then a capital Y. And I'm going to say that equals 10. And then finish it with a semicolon, and then I hit create.
That equals
equals 10.
equals 10. So when doing things with expressions, it's kind of like any other kind of programming. A single equal sign isn't about checking equality. It's about assigning a value. So you're saying in Maya, it's always the left is being controlled by the right. Yeah? So ball.translate y is now 10. So if I look, it's 10 and it's purple, right? Which is extremely boring, right? I mean, that's not very hard to do. The point of expressions is that they can always sort of calculate. So instead of doing 10, I'm going to insert one of the simple little functions here. So I'm going to take the sign, so as any other sort of trig, I'm going to take the sign of the frame. Yep. And once I do that, I have to hit edit to update it, and it snapped back down to here. So what's basically happening is every time the frame ticks over, or every time you move it, it's recalculating this. This word frame is a kind of keyword within Maya that basically says what is the frame number. Obviously, as the time changes, the frame changes, and that value changes. So now, if I give it more, go back to 100, if I hit play, it vibrates up and down. Why? What does a sine curve do? 1, -1, 1, -1, 1, -1, right? And we're basically just stepping across the sine curve with the frame, right? So as I change this, we're hitting a different point on that sine curve. But right now, I mean, if you look at it, so it's going to go between 1 and -1, because that's what sine curves do, right? That's just how they work. So that's good fun and all. But, what if you wanted it to be not just between -1 and 1? Like, say if you wanted it to be between -10 and 10, right? So just like basically changing the amplitude. Well, we need to change our expression. So to do that, I'm going to go back in the expression editor. And this is an important thing to remember before you lose like 2 hours of your life in Maya that you'll never get back. Because you're going to get here and you're going to select this and you're going to be like, well, where the fuck did the old expression go? I just wrote it. I know it's in there. Where is it? I can't find it. Then you're going to delete the thing and do it over again after you get frustrated because you can't find it. So the way you do that is, or the way you don't do that, I should say. In the expression editor, there's this menu called the select filter, and you change that to by expression name. So now when you open the expression editor, it's going to list all the expressions that you've made. So now it's listed this thing called expression 1. I click it, and now we're back. Right? If you don't know that, it will drive you nuts the first time. If what I basically wanted to do now is to change the amplitude of how much it's moving, right? So it's only moving between -1 and 1, and I want to say move between -10 and 10. All I have to do is we're calculating the sine of frame and just say times 10. Yeah? Because it's just an equation. Even though this is all text, it's just pointing to a number. So it's just, you would write it like you would any equation. So I'd say times 10, and I hit edit. So now it goes between those two. Another kind of trick which changes it here, which is doing it as time. Time slows it down because it's again working off of 24 frames a second. So this is actually moving, frame, it's going to jump, every frame, where this is actually working off the sort of 24 frames a second timeline. So again, if I wanted it to move even higher, you could say times 20.
Do all of its straight radians instead of degrees?
You can. It defaults to degrees. Most things are. Everything's pretty much done. You can do it in radians if you're feeling fun. But generally, when we're dealing with rotations and stuff, it does it as degrees. You can do it both ways. And if you look, it'll tell you a lot of the built-in functions. There's also, we'll come back to this. Any of these sorts of things. So as I mentioned, though, even though we're kind of defining the translate y with, let's do this first. So let's say we're now controlling translate y. I could also simply do it for x too if I wanted to kind of change things that way. So if I just go in here, let's just doing copy, go down a line, hit paste, and I'm just going to change that y to an x. So now we have two things. Yeah, so now it's flipping both of them back and forth, changing the number. I'm going to get rid of that for now. Edit it. So you can see it. I'm going to scale it a little bit. I could also, if I wanted to, between say 0 and 100, I can also just key a, say, rotation value. So let's say I went back to as I was doing it before. So at frame 1, rotate y. I'm going to key it there, and at frame 100, 360. Oops. This is why you change the frame first. So yeah. So one's being controlled by the expression, the other one's being controlled by a simple keyframe. It doesn't care. The one thing you can't do is say, once this is controlled by an expression, if I try to go in here and just key this value, if I said, I want that to be 1, it's going to say, you can't be able to read that error. Basically, it says you can't do that because it's already being controlled by something else. Starting out with, an attribute can only be controlled by one thing. There's ways around it. But for today, things can only be controlled by one thing. Mixed together, it doesn't care, right? I mean, and just like before, let's say I wanted to put a funny nose on the thing. eyeball things. There. So just like before, I'm going to pick this guy, pick the sphere, parent it together. All you're doing is it's just like a funny little data network, right? You're just plugging values in to get a kind of overall effect. Make sense? So,
If you click just the functions you just added, and then will it have its own separate relationship editor as far as the expression in there?
yes. You know, I could here, we'll do this. So now we'll have a bit more fun. So we'll say, we'll go back to the expression editor. And I'll add it to this one. Oops. We're going to call this nose. And I'm also going to say, I don't know, nose.scale z. And I'll do this off side as well. It's going to be too big, so I'll take its value down to, say, 4. Yeah, it's just needs a name. So I want to show you, get slightly more advanced before we move on to the next part.
Can I stop you real quick?
Yes.
And ask you, what happens if you were to, say, reorient an object? Does that ruin the relationship that you just built?
So let's say if I rotated this thing.
Like if you moved it, and then I know there's like, I think an option that says like reorient.
Well, if I move it, like, you know, if I say move it out here, it's just going to work out there. Because it kind of gets its own new sort of space. You know, nothing's controlling that. You know, the only input it gets is this thing kind of becomes its new origin point that it's stuck to. You know, nothing's controlling even the rotate Y. You know, if I made it more of a party hat instead of a nose, to use technical terms. Right?
What if you change the pivot point?
The pivot point will, yeah, I haven't got to pivot points yet, but yeah, the pivot points will screw it up. We're going to get to pivot points in a second. Pivot points being the second thing that would drive you nuts.
Go back to center pivot. Be okay.
Yes, it's centered now. So before we talk about that stuff though, so right now, I have this set up as a relationship where it's moving, say, you know, sine and has this multiplier of 20. The scale has a multiplier of, say, 4. And to change that, I've got to go open the expression editor, change it again, update it, see what it looks like. But wouldn't it be fun if these could also become dynamic values? So that's very simple. So to do that, I'm going to do it on the ball, but it doesn't actually matter where. So on the ball, I'm going to go under Edit and say Add Attribute, right? These are the default attributes, but the wonderful thing is you can add your own. as long as you don't name them something that exists, they can be anything. So I'm going to call this ROT factor. Then it wants to know, is it keyable? Yes. The data type, we're going to leave it as a float being like these things, so a number that can have a decimal, whereas, say, an integer can only be a whole number. String is text, and a boolean is just, well, it's like visibility on and off. So we're gonna do it as a float. And I'm going to say add. And I'm going to make a second one called SC factor. Same thing. And hit add. Right? So now, it's just a number. It doesn't do anything, right? I mean, all we've basically done is basically like given an address so you can get the information from it, right? So now, if I wanted to read this, it would just be ball.rot factor, right? So if I go back to my expression, so first, I'll give these a value, I'll give them both a 1. But obviously it doesn't do anything. I mean, I could give it a value of, still doesn't do anything. Because it's just a holder, right? It's kind of like, it's an email address, right? I mean, you haven't sent it anything, you haven't asked it anything, but it has an address, right? Like there's a way, there's something you can point to. So I'm going to go into my on a separate note of general Maya stuff, on any of the menus where you see this kind of double line, if you click it, it pulls it off, so you don't have to always do it. I don't do it as much when it makes my resolution so small, but normally, so if you're going back and forth to the expression editor a lot, you just leave this over here. So, now I don't want to have it a fixed value, I want to have it another kind of dynamic attribute. So instead of typing 20 as a number, I'm going to point it to a dynamic number. And the way I do that is by knowing the object's name, which is ball, and then .rot factor, right? So the name that I gave it. And I'm going to do the same thing here. So ball.sc factor, and edit it. Make sense? So I made these two attributes just as placeholders. Now, instead of me typing things here, this is just like a dynamic link that says what is written there, and then make that the multiplier. So now it looks like this. If I want to change it, same thing with the scale. So now let's do something extra crazy. I'm going to give myself a few more frames. I'm going to give it, say, 200 frames. So let's say from 0 to 100, I want it to be one thing, and then I want to change it and have it behave differently from 100 to 200. Again, even though I made them, they're just attributes like everything else, which means I can animate their value. So let's say at frame 1, I want the rotation factor to be 1. And key that. And then at say 50, I want it to be 30. key that. 100. I don't know. Make it 10 again. And then at 200, we'll kick it back down to 1. Right? So it's all about layering stuff together. I could obviously do the same thing with this. I'll just make this kind of linear. So we'll say 1. Actually, we'll do it half and half. So then I'll go 100. And it can be, yeah, 10's fine. And then we move back to 1. Make sense? So, what to take away from that? You know, we're going to continue looking at expressions. So, I mean, it's just to understand, like, what expressions let you do is either kind of control these numbers through mathematical functions, or as we'll look at through relationships. But the other thing is the way that you get to them is simply by their name. So if you know the name of an attribute, you can control it. I mean, to go back to my previous example just quickly, like if I had this thing, and if I wanted this, if I wanted the face to be controlled by an expression, so, oops. So again, this gets a little trickier because now, as I mentioned last time, you go, the new node it created is called polyextrude face 1. It has an attribute called local scale z. Once you start writing, so if I want to write an expression for that, I have to be able to know that object's name, write the kind of attribute name right. There are no spaces, so you get into this kind of pain in the ass of like, how do I write that without having to just like try it 50 times? Well, there's a wonderful little cheat in Maya. And that happens down here in the script editor. You'll see it in the very, very bottom right-hand corner. And we aren't going to talk very much about kind of script stuff in Maya, but the beautiful thing is that there's really no difference in Maya whether you do something in the interface or if you do it in a script, and it mirrors the two back and forth. So if I click on the script editor, up here at the top, as you do things in the interface in Maya, it's basically listing them out what the sort of script equivalent is. So when I do something simple like change the value of local scale z to say 3, it's actually performing if you were doing it as a command, it would be set attribute, but wonderfully, it gives you the name of the object and the attribute. So on any of these things, if you don't know what it is, you basically type a number into it, look in the script editor, copy paste it. Yeah, so highlighted it. I'm now going to go to my expression editor, paste it, and keep this one small, so I'll say this one is just equals. So for this, I don't actually want it to go in, so I'll say +1. Oops. Hello? Oh. Of course. Everything's going.
The sphere, say?
Not even. Oh, because I typed in the wrong one to start with. So, small issue. If you're going to use the trick, it's important to actually type the number into the. Because if you notice, I have local scale Z instead of local translate Z. So, my error. Use the same trick though, so I just type a number in, scroll at the bottom. Yeah. If you're going to do things by the attribute, you have to actually use the right attribute. It's a crazy concept. All right, so what time is it? God, 3:30. Why don't we, let's take 10 minutes and then come back to this.